And I say you can't.
You can!
Now look, you can't spend all the money we made just to buy a new home.
He's right, sis. We gotta save some money for the income tax.
Don't be chumps. Make out your returns in such a way that you don't have to pay income tax.
What did you guys think of that? Ouch!
And there we have the Three Stooges joking around about cheating on their income taxes. And with us today to talk about Canadian income taxes and this 97-year anniversary of the income taxes coming into force, Candice Malcolm, of the Ontario Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. So I'm deeply disheartened because this was originally supposed to be a temporary measure. And here we are, 97 years later, still burdened by income taxes.
Right. Well, Milton Friedman said there's nothing so permanent as a temporary tax. So 97 years ago, they actually were very reluctant, Rebecca, to bring in this income tax. It was a wartime measure. It was halfway through the First World War. They'd managed to get through the first 3 years Canada had without bringing in the income tax. Instead, they just kind of raised tariffs and started taxing different products coming into the country. But 3 years into the war, they absolutely needed the revenue. So they implemented a 4% income tax on all income over $1,500 in the country, and now here we are 97 years later still with this supposedly temporary tax measure.
Yeah, and I mean, and why not? You know, at the time Canada was coming of age, the UK and the US both had income taxes. You know, I don't know if theirs were intended to be temporary, but here in Canada, the Prime Minister at the time, Robert Borden, said, look, this is just a temporary measure right here in Canada. Now, and I know that you guys have analyzed this to no end, we have this Income Tax Act that is hundreds and hundreds of pages. It is one of the most convoluted, complicated tax codes that nobody can really seem to decipher. I, in fact, know somebody who works on income taxes in Canada, is a lawyer, and still, after years of being employed in defending people on income tax or targeting people for income tax fraud, still doesn't know the entire income tax code.
Well, it would be impossible to do it, Rebecca. It would take years and years to read through the entire thing. It's very convoluted and complicated. And in some ways, I think it's intended to be that way. It's sort of a make-work project. It creates hundreds and thousands of jobs across the country in law offices and accounting offices just to help people navigate through this. The CTF has long called for simplifying flattened taxes. Like Alberta, for instance, has a 10% flat tax for all income over a certain rate. So there's an exemption, and then everything after that, you pay 1% or one flat rate. Whereas in other Canadian provinces and the federal income tax, the more you make, the more you get taxed, and each amount of income gets taxed at a different rate. It ranges from 15% all the way up to almost 45%, 50% in some provinces. So it is very complicated. It wasn't originally, Rebecca. When I go through the history and sort of the renditions of the time, they were very cautious about bringing in the tax. Robert Borden and his finance minister, Sir Thomas White, they didn't want to. They knew it would have a negative impact on the economy and all of society. They were very cautious about bringing it in, and when they did, they introduced a very small, simple tax, and it's devolved and become very complicated over the years.
You know who is not cautious is Premier Kathleen Wynne, because she wants to hike these income taxes. So this is Candice Malcolm joining us. We will be back to talk more about income taxes after the break. We're talking about income taxes and the fact that in Canada, 97 years ago, income taxes were introduced, originally supposed to be a temporary measure. Now, you've done some research about what the origins are for income taxes in not only in Canada, but around the world.
Yeah, so Canada originally didn't have an income tax, and it was sort of a way for us to compete against other places in the world to try to attract people. So we'd have people move to Canada and say, hey, you don't have to pay income taxes. England brought in their income taxes during the Napoleonic Wars, so 1799 under King George III. They brought it in again as a temporary act to help fund the Napoleonic Wars in France and other places in Europe. And of course, it stayed. The United States brought their income tax in during the Civil War in 1867. So they had these income taxes. Canada didn't have them, and so they're actually not a Canadian invention. A lot of folks think, oh, Canadians have high taxes and we must have a long history of taxation. Canada was actually the first tax haven. It was a low tax jurisdiction, and it wasn't until that odious time 97 years ago that we did bring in this income tax, and now, of course, taxes have exploded all over the country and all across the economy.
Now, nobody likes income taxes. Do you have any references of any jurisdictions in the world who have not only tried to eradicate income taxes, but maybe succeeded in income taxes. And will Canada ever follow suit?
Well, I think even if you look within Canada, like I said, Alberta is a great example of bringing in a simplified version of a tax. So instead of having to figure out, all the different income brackets, there's just one. Alberta actually brings in more income tax per capita than any other province in the country, even though it is a flatter, simpler way of collecting taxes. So I think the feds could take a lesson from the book of Alberta. It was actually Stockwell Day was the finance minister under Ralph
the flat
Tyne.
tax proposed by the Canadian Alliance at the time.
Yeah. So.
And obviously Alberta is economically successful, and perhaps this is a reason why Alberta is able to attract so many people to the province, because of the fact that they have low taxes. Not only, as you mentioned, this flat tax with income tax, but also when it comes to government sales tax.
Exactly. There are a lot of things. It's not just Alberta's booming economy. It's also the governance component that makes Alberta attractive. So things like not having a sales tax, having that flatter, simpler income tax, as well as sort of the resource development that goes on. But I think certainly here in Ontario, we're heading in the opposite direction. We have a government that's raising income taxes on high net worth, high income individuals, even medium income individuals. That's moving forward with new payroll taxes, taxing both employees and employers on their income to create a new pension scheme. So Ontario is sort of heading in the opposite direction, unfortunately. But I think Alberta still remains a shining example of good tax policy.
Now, although I don't want to, I'll play devil's advocate for a second here and say that without income taxes coming into government banks, basically, how is the government supposed to supply all these public goods, for example, better infrastructure and all of these goods and services that we enjoy as a result of government initiatives, if there isn't any income tax?
Well, you're right. Income tax is about 40% of government revenue, but at the same time, government employee compensation is about 50% of revenue. So I don't really think that without income taxes we wouldn't have basic infrastructure. We pay a host of other taxes, from gasoline taxes, all kinds of excess taxes, sales taxes. Plus still we have imports and taxes and tariffs. So, I think that really what income tax has done has allowed the bureaucracy to grow, has allowed the government to grow, because they have so much access to revenue. So, if we could even go back to, not go back to 1917 tax rates, but go back a little bit further, I think it would be more manageable. Canadians would have more money in their own pockets to actually be able to save for their own retirement or do what they want.
Yeah, I mean, it looks like we're never going to get rid of income tax, will it? But, if you add up and if you tally a list of all the various different types of taxes that have been introduced, not just 97 years ago, but over the past 50 years or over the past 20 years, I'm sure the list has grown to be huge. And so perhaps moving forward, a good task would be, if we want to actually eradicate taxes, which tax should we get rid of? Because I suspect it's not going to be the income tax.
Yeah, that's probably pretty fair. People are so used to paying their income taxes that you don't really see people even, being upset about it. You don't see anyone protesting over having to pay income taxes, and that's just maybe a fact of life in Canada. But I think it's a great point that we should be on the lookout, making sure that the government isn't there to impose any new taxes.
Good. Well, thank you very much for coming in, Candice. That's Candice.